Okay, can you hear me? Cool. So hello everybody. Judging from the size of the room, I guess that all of you are writing bugs. So you came to the right place. So I think that this tweet that I take a screenshot of kind of summarize my feeling about it. So if you always wanted to travel back in time and try to find a younger version of yourself, then software development is the career for you. Um, I can probably argue that developers most of the time writing more new bugs than fixing old bugs. And the problem is that when we are getting to the point that we need to go and investigate and analyze why something is happening the way it is and not doing the thing we planned it to do, it's probably after a lot of time since we really wrote it. And so when we get to this point of trying to solve this crime mystery, this kind of murder scene, what happened, who is the criminal, usually we end up finding that it was ours, but it took a long time until we got to this point. And when we get to this point, we need to find tools, and we need to find techniques, and we need to find a process to help us discover what was really this little thing that triggered the whole kind of area of disaster. So my name is Tamir DRESHER. I'm coming from Israel. I'm the chief architect of a company called Clarizen. I'm also a software engineering lecturer at the European Academic Center. I wrote a few books. You can find them on Amazon and other sources. Go buy them. It gives me money. But really, my Twitter handle is written on the slide, and feel free to contact me and reach me if you have any questions or just want to talk. And of course, I'll be around in this conference for the rest of the day, so you can come and talk to me. So just a few words about Clarizen. Clarizen is a SaaS company. We provide a service for enterprises and companies for everything related to work management and project planning. Starting from financial planning and resource management and task allocation and all those things. We are considered leaders in that field. And we are serving thousands of companies and millions of projects that are being run each day on our product. And we are using .NET, if this was a question. So the agenda for today is kind of split into two. For the first part, I'm going to take a real life scenario, a real thing that happened in reality, a problem that was really hard for us to discover what was the source for that problem. And I'm going to kind of share with you the process and what I did in order to find where the bug came from and the tools I used, which hopefully will give you some thing that you can take later on for your development life. And the second part will go into a few tips and tricks that I gathered. And we'll see how much the time will allow me to show you, because basically this slide, you can't see it here, but I have 71 slides, so I'm not sure I can cover them all. So if I do, we do. If not, then I'll try to pick the ones that I think that are most important. So let's talk about the real, this real bug, this real scenario that we had. And I'm not sure how many of you have ever worked in the semiconductor field and created project applications that are being used inside fabs. Fabs are those factories that create chips and wafers and all kinds of nanotechnology instruments. And so when you have this kind of an industry, the most important thing in that industry is the intellectual property, which means once your application was deployed into the fab, you can't really go and see what's going on. And if you have a bug inside, it can take months until you get a single trace or a single log to look at. And so whenever there's a bug, it's becoming really, really hard to find the problem, especially if this bug is not something that is reproducible each time. And so just as an anecdote, if you go into a fab, everything you bring with you needs to stay in the fab. You can't come with a laptop and then take it with you. If you bring a laptop, it stays inside the fab. So it makes it really, really hard to go and analyze production problems. So I'm not going to show the real application, of course, because intellectual property and such. But as a simulation, let's talk about a really, really simple application that shows the same problem. So this application is kind of a to-do application where the user can go and create something called a notebook. We have a service, I call it To-Do API, and the user sends a request to this API to create a notebook. What happened behind the scenes is that a database is created for each notebook to hold all the to-do items inside this notebook. And then the user can go and create to-do items. It sends a post request to the API, and this later goes and insert a new row into the database, and everything works perfectly fine. Now, one of the really, really important features of this product is the ability to go and export your notebook and later on import it in another machine. So the real application handled simulation, physical simulations of all kinds of lasers and a lot of big words. And so it created a mass of raw data that later on someone needs to take this database and go and do investigation about what happened inside. So this was a really key feature to the product. And so we were a .NET shop. We created a .NET application, and for us it was really easy to use Entity Framework. And what we did, because we wanted it to be fast and as simple as possible, when we needed to export the data, we just exported a database, and when we needed to import the data into another process in another machine, we just loaded this simple local database and took all the data from inside. Okay, so let's look at this simple application and see where the problem starts. So I'm not going to show a fancy UI. I hope that you all know about APIs and REST calls and stuff like that. So this is a Swagger UI. This is a way for me to show you like a way to work with my API. So I can go and I can create a new notebook using this API call, post to an API notebook. So I'm going to create a new notebook. And it's going behind the scene, it's creating my database, and everything should work, hopefully. Let's pray for the demo gods. And after the notebook will be created, it will send me back an identifier, hopefully. Maybe I'm on a breakpoint, just to make sure. No breakpoint. Please, please, please work. Let's try a different call just to see if, okay, so the application is working. So I have another, yeah. So I have another notebook. Maybe it's the same one I created, I'm not sure. So I can take the ID of that notebook, and then I can go, oh, here you see, it finally gave me this identifier. And later I can go into my to-do items APIs, and I can create a few to-do items inside and give it some title. I don't know, make sure the demo works before presentation, okay? And it creates one, and then I can do something like create slides and all kind of other to-do items. And it goes and do it, and then I can go and see all my to-do items, and later on just change their is completed property. You see I have a property here, is completed, that says if it's completed or not. So the feature we are talking about, okay, is the feature of exporting. I can go and really put the ID of my notebook, export it. This will take the database, wrap it up inside some zip file, put it inside some file on my local disk, and later on, and I get my path to the file itself, and later on I can go and I can import some other notebook that I prepared. Okay, so I have a notebook over here called my lovely notebook. I can load it. and it will bring it into the system, and then I can go and query and see all the to-do items. So this application works when it works, and people are using it. People are using it, and they love it, and they're using the export and the import, and everything works really, really fine. So at some point, after a few versions, running at a few big customers around the world, we started to get complaints about something really weird that is happening. Users are going and importing their notebooks, something that they saved from some time ago. You can see that we got the response code of 200, everything is okay. And we can see the notebook is really inside the database. We can see it's a part of our application. But then, when they try to do something like querying and seeing all the to-do items inside, they get this nasty exception that you can't really see very well, but we have an exception over here. And the exception itself, I'll show you a little bigger, just so it will be more clear. So this exception that we have here, if some of you have used Entity Framework before, they might understand it, and they might encountered it in the past. So basically, it tells me that for some reason, some of the columns that I was relying on in the database is not there. And that's really, really weird, because we loaded perfectly fine, everything is okay. And this is Entity Framework, so it should handle it, and I'll explain why in a minute. And the most weird part of it is that once in a while, it just fixes itself, meaning that the next time, somewhere in the future, when someone go and try to query again this same notebook, it finished successfully. So what's going on? When we load it, it's not working, and if we wait long enough, I don't know how much time, it suddenly fixes itself. The problem fixes itself. So before we go deep and try to analyze this specific problem and use the different tools, I need to, if you are not familiar with Entity Framework, just share some little information about how Entity Framework works. So one of the things that Entity Framework provides is the ability to add migrations. So I have my application, and in my application, every time I'm changing my model, I'm changing the data model inside my application, I can create something called a migration that holds all the steps needed to change the schema on the database itself. And when I'm connecting to my database, the application sends a request into the database to fetch the migrations inside the database. We have a specific table called migration history. It holds all the records about the different migration that this database was going through. In each one, we have something called the model. And the model, you can see it's a binary. So we can later go and compare the binary of kind of a hash of the model to the one we have in our application and see if it fits. And if it doesn't fit, what my application is doing is running the migrations on the database to add the new steps, to add the new columns, to add the data if it needed, and do all kinds of steps to the database itself. So this is how Entity Framework works. The question is, why it doesn't work the first time, but sometimes in the future, it works perfectly fine. Okay, this is the question that we need to answer. And specifically, because the error that we see on the screen is about something called is completed, so in this case, it's probably related to the migration that the is completed field was added in. Okay, so this is our starting point. So let's go to Visual Studio. And basically, the first thing, usually when you have an exception and you want to go and analyze it, is to go to where the exception is thrown, right? This is the thing you want to do. So to do that, what we need to do is to make sure that my application halt not when the exception is being caught, but when it is being thrown. So part of the things that I'm showing, some of you might have known, but I hope it will give you kind of alignment. So in Visual Studio, you have this exception settings window, right? And what it shows you specifically is all kind of groups of exceptions. And you can go and open each one of those groups and select an exception. Now, you can see that some of them are marked, some of them are not, and some of them is marked in a different way. So usually, when exception is thrown, you are not going to the place where the exception was thrown from. You are going to the last point in the stack where the exception is handled. To fix that, or to change that, you can just mark this element, meaning that I want to stop at the point the exception has really been thrown from, okay? The source of the exception. So now that I turn this on, I can go again to my application and load the debugging notebook that I have. Let's load my crazy notebook. This is the one. Okay. Now, one of the things you will see is that you will start having many exceptions. Okay. And the reason is that some exceptions are okay that are being thrown because someone else is taking care of it. But still, the system will stop me every time. So the first thing you need to realize is, where is the problem starting? Is it starting when I'm loading my notebook, or is it when I'm trying to open it? Okay. So to save time, I'm going to tell you that it's kind of both way, but let's start with the exception we see. And the exception we see is not when I'm importing my notebook, right? It's when I'm trying to load the items from the notebook. So let's turn it off for this moment and continue. And you can see that even though there was an exception, this request will finish perfectly fine after a few minutes. And then I'm going to take the ID of this notebook and see what happens. Okay, so this is the ID of my notebook that I just imported. So now I can go and again turn on my exception handling. Okay, I want to stop when the exception is really being thrown. So let's do that. And now let's go and try to read the to-do items from that faulty notebook. And it should have stopped because I'm not like this. Okay, so let's fix that. And do it again. So I deleted the notebook and I'm going to import it again because I missed the checkbox. And now I'm really going to check it and do the get operation. And we are at the point of the exception, okay? And we can see that there is an invalid column called the creation time in this case, okay? Which is another one, okay? But okay, we'll have to deal with that. So the thing you see on the screen, just so I'll be clear about it, I'm using a really nice tool called Oscode. Oscode is a debugging utility that you can add to Visual Studio. A little disclaimer, I am not working with Oscode. I'm not any part of Oscode, but in the past, I have some investment in that company, okay? And the creator is a good friend of mine. But today, I have no relation whatsoever to the company. But Oscode really gives us all kinds of utilities that can help us. For example, what I did just now with this exception checking, another way to do it, if you see this button over here, usually breaking on all CLR exception is something we do a lot when we want to debug code. So instead of going into this window and trying to mark all those things, we can just use this button and click it and start and stop the break on all exception. So just another thing. And it gives me all these little areas over here, and I can look into the exception details in a nice UI that sometimes give me more information, and can even go and search it inside Stack Overflow and all kind of other locations. But never mind. So we are seeing this exception. And now what we want to do is go and see what is the call stack for this exception. Basically, what we see over here is that this exception, okay, is being handled here. There's a lot of calls going on here, and it's not really easy to understand where is the problem. But we can see somewhere along the way there's some kind of SQL command that have been created and sent to the database. So it doesn't give us much, but what it gives us is the ability to know that there is a problem in the database itself. Okay? When I'm doing the querying, something is missing. So I can go, and I really went into the database itself and saw that really this column is missing. But wait, I know that Entity Framework needs to do the migration. Okay? It needs to go and do all kind of migration steps in order to work with this new database and add the thing that is missing. In this case, it's the creation time. Okay? So what I'm going to do instead is going to where the creation time, it's another field. Okay? I want to see when it is added, and it is being added here, right? So this is the place where I really want to stop. I want to stop at the place that adds it. So to make the long story short, okay, I started my application and I breakpoint inside this place. And at the beginning, it was not really clear what's going on. So I tried to see what happened with a notebook that works perfectly fine and a notebook that doesn't work perfectly fine. Okay? When a notebook is really working the way it should work, I'm stopping at this breakpoint, and I have this stack trace that you see over here, or not see very well, so let's fix that. Okay, so we have all these stack trace. And what I wanted to do is go and see why the create if not exist. You see I have a line here in the stack trace of create if not exist. This is the location I want to go and understand why it's not doing my upgrade in the DB migrator. But how can I do that? Okay, I can stop at my code, right? I found a way to stop at my code, but when I got to this point is after the decision was made by this create if not exist method, right? So one of the things you can do, let's try that. I don't know why I stopped the application. Never mind. So let's try to stop at this location and see how we can go now and investigate what's going on in a code that is not code that I own, right? So let's create another notebook, and I think I need to uncheck this checkbox, probably, or just do something like this. Okay, let it run. So let's create this notebook. And it should stop at the location that I just put a breakpoint in. Sometime. Loading, loading. Now, when it will stop and I get the stack trace, I can see the name of the method. So one of the things that people don't really know is that you have the ability to create a breakpoint wherever you just like, okay? Most of us, when they need to do a breakpoint, they go into the source code. Let's say I want to go here, and they do, and they click here, right, on the side, or they do F9. But you have another way to do breakpoints if you need. One of the very, very useful ways is if you go to the breakpoint window that you have over here, okay, that you can go to from the debug. Oh, finally, it got here, okay. So let's say I want to stop at this location, somewhere called the create. So let's say this one, database creator, create database. This is the name of the function, and this is the full qualified name of the type. So one way to do that is if you go to this place over here, you can just F9, okay? And you can add a breakpoint, and I'll discuss this message in a bit, but basically you can put a breakpoint wherever you want. Okay, you see, I just F9 on this line, so I added a breakpoint in this location. Sometimes you don't really know in advance in which of the overloads you want to stop in. Okay? Sometimes you have a method, you know the name of the method, maybe you've seen it in a log, but you don't really know the exact overload. So a good trick to know is that if you go into the breakpoint window that you can add through the debug, and then you will have breakpoints, and you can also add new breakpoint from here. So when you have a function breakpoint, you can write the name of the type and the name of the method, and you don't have to put any parameters inside. So for example, if I have this place where I wanted to stop, okay, so I could just take this, create another breakpoint, paste it, and remove all the names of the parameters and the types that we have inside. It's a long one. So when we have this, here we go, okay. So when we have something like this, okay, this is the name of the method, okay, and we didn't provide any of the parameters, the system automatically will stop at any call to this method, no matter which overload is the one that is being used. So the confusing thing is that this won't work just out of the box. Why? Because this method is not my method, okay? And Visual Studio by default will not debug code that is not yours. So it's very important that if you want to stop at code that is not your code, you need to go into the settings menu, tools, options, and inside the debugging settings, you have this code over here, you see? Enable just my code. By default, it's off, okay? It's disabled. It's on, sorry. By default, it is enabled to stop only in your code. It will not stop at code that you brought from another library. So if you want to stop at other locations, you need to turn this off, right? Disable the enable just my code, okay? So now that we have this breakpoint over here, this is the one I set. When I'm going to run again, and I disabled that just my code, it should stop at this place. So another tricky thing to know is that we don't know in advance when is it going to load this specific assembly, right? You have your code, okay? And you don't really know when it is going to stop there, right? When it is going to be called, the assembly itself. So if I'm going right now to this specific location, let's say I want to see the code itself, okay? I want to delve in. I didn't want this assembly. Go ahead. Okay. So I want to see the code itself, okay? I'm stopping at the location. I want to see the code itself, okay? In order to do that, I need symbols, okay? Everybody knows about symbols, okay? And why we need them, okay? So when you are compiling your code, you get some kind of, let's call it a machine code, right? In .NET, we have the intermediate language code. So this is not the sources that you build from. If you want to debug and see your sources, you need symbols. When you are creating your deployments, you will have a PDB files. But in this case, this is Entity Framework. Entity Framework is not mine. I don't have the symbols, okay? So one thing you can do, because Entity Framework is open source, you can go and read the source code inside GitHub. It will work. But it doesn't give you the ability to debug and see the traces and see everything goes inside. So one really, really useful thing you can do to overcome it is with a tool called .pick. Do you know about .pick? It's a free tool. You can download it by JetBrains. And this is a disassembler, okay? It allows you to take an assembly and disassemble it to a readable source code. One of the very, very nice features they have is the ability to create from .pick a symbol server. So if I'm going to Tools, I can now start the symbol server. It will add this little icon that you see underneath over here. And when I right-click it, it will give me the ability to copy the symbol server URL. Nice. So now that I have this symbol server URL, I can go into my window that you see over here. When I try to go and see the code of this place in my code stack that I don't have the source to, and I can add a new path. I can add a new symbol server path. So this is one thing you can do when you are debugging and you need it right now. If you want to be prepared, you can go again into the Tools option menu. Under the debugging, you have the symbols entry, and you can add and advance the symbol server URLs. So now that I have my symbol server, and you see it's here, and it is enabled, I can click on it and I can say load. Now what this will do, basically, if we go into .pick, because I already did it before, you don't see it right now, but in this right screen over here, you have the project PDB generation status. So Visual Studio is sending to the symbol server a request to generate PDBs. And .pick will take the assembly I'm trying to analyze, and it will try to generate this PDB. It might take a while, but after it completes, and what you will see here is the status of this generation, Visual Studio get in return all the source code. So now you can see my call stack is no longer in gray mode. It is now in regular text. It's in black. And I can go and I can really see the code itself. Okay? So this is cool. The problem is that if you want to debug something outside of a breakpoint that you are currently in, and you want to stop at that location, for example, this place over here, I want to stop when this method is starting. I want to add a breakpoint here. When I restart my application and trying to debug, it will not stop. The reason is that you don't have the symbols just when you started the application. So the thing it's important for you to do, if you want to stop at some place at the beginning of the application and you don't really know when, is to go into the debug windows and go to the modules window right here. You see the modules? And what it will show you is all the assemblies, all the modules that are loaded into the application. So what you need to do is before you are getting to the part where the problem occurs, okay, but you know that the assembly was loaded, you can go, and let's look at some assembly that I have here. In here, this is Entity Framework. So in Entity Framework right now, what you can see is that the symbols are loaded, and the symbol file is this one that was generated by JetBrains, by the .pick. And you can see here that I have Entity Framework SQL Server DLL. This one is not loaded right now. The symbol is loading. So what I can do here is I can go and say load symbols. So now I can force the loading of symbols even before my problem is going to happen, and make sure that when I get to the point, I will have all the lines that I need. Okay? So it will make it easier for the Visual Studio to stop at the location I wanted it to stop. So now the request was sent to .pick, and if we go to .pick, you see now that we have a new record over here and the status of the generation of the PDB. Visual Studio in the meantime might have a timeout for waiting, and that's okay. You just need to go and click the load again. Okay? So it's waiting for the sources. After a few moments, it will stop being frozen. And then it's the time that you need to click on the load again, so it will load those symbols. Great. So this completed, and now I have the symbols in place, and I can go and look at the code. So this is a few of the tools that were needed from my side in order to go and see what's going on. Why does the problem happen? Specifically what I saw, I think I'm going to change so I can see with you the slides and make it bigger when needed. Okay. So I saw that there's this call over here. When a normal um, time that I'm loading and creating my database, what I saw is that, let's look at here, this is what I just showed you. Okay? And so I saw that in my create database, there is a call underneath to mark database initialized. And what I discovered is that when the migration did work, initialized database that you see over here, right, it is calling something called perform database initialization. And when it's not working correctly, you have this mark database initialized, and it took me a while to figure it out, but if you can see over here that there is initialized database action, and there is an initialized database section over here. And the thing that is being called when the migration works is a lambda expression, right? Is a function that was provided. And when this one over here at the above, at the top was called, it gave an empty lambda expression. So this is weird, okay? So after drilling a bit, what I saw is basically that inside entity framework, okay, there's this line. Yeah, do you see the problem? So I'll help you, okay? The problem is that there is a static modifier. You see the static modifier? And basically what this means is that if you are loading a database, the same database a few times, okay, it will have the same key inside this static collection. So it might be that a database with the specific connection string was loaded once. It did all the operation it did. It was migrated. So entity framework now knows that this is a context, the class that represented the database, in a final position that is correct. And the next time you are going to load the database, it thinks that it already did it, right? Because this is a static. It is shared among the all the way of the run of this process. And so really, what this means is that you cannot really load the same database over and over again, because migration will only happen the first time. And this explains why, after some time, the problem fixes itself. Because when the process recycled itself, the web server recycled itself, the static is gone. And the next time I'm connecting to this database, I don't have anything inside this dictionary that you have over here. And so it will do the same operation of checking if the migration needs to take place, right? Now, this is very, very hard to do without seeing the code that is doing that, without noticing this static modifier that means that you get the same value inside the dictionary every time you load the same database. So this is one example of how tools can make our life easier and are really needed when you're debugging those problems. Another place where it's really, really hard to debug is when you have assemblies that are failing to load. Ever happened to you? You run your application, at some point the application just crashed and it says that it couldn't find some assembly. And this is thing that can only happen in the production. It doesn't happen in debug. Everything works correctly. So what do you do to fix that? Or how can you find the source of the problem? So one of the tools that developers don't know about is a tool that is part of the .NET framework, is part of the SDK. It's called the Fusion Log Viewer, okay? So this is the fuzz log VW. Basically, all you need to do is just open the command prompt for the developers. Just write FUS, it's a short for fuzz, and log VW, so it's fuse log viewer. And this open this window. And in this window, you can go into the settings. And it's really important that you see now that I won't be able to do anything. Okay? Do you know why? Nothing make it obvious, but the reason is that my command prompt was not in admin mode. Okay? So if you want it to work, you have to open your developer command prompt and do it as an administrator. This is very important because otherwise you see things that you don't understand why it's happening. So now that I'm running it as an admin, again, FUS, go ahead. Well, okay. And now inside this window in setting, everything is enabled for me. And what you can specify here is that you want to catch and write a log entry for every event of loading an assembly. And you can choose if you only want to see the exception or only the bind failures, or if you want to see every binding, meaning every time the CLRs try to load an assembly, you want to see it, you can choose it and just and specify if you want to put it inside a file. So suppose I'm doing that, I'm running my application, what you will see, in the case of, this is the application I wrote, calling missing reference, I wonder what it do. And basically, in development, when I'm compiling, I have a reference to some assembly called reference library. But after the application was compiled, I delete the referenced assembly. So what happened is when my application starts, it immediately crashes. And I'm seeing over here that the application is trying to load the reference assembly, the reference library. And if you double click it, you will get a full report that specifies where the application made the searches, in which of the folders. And sometimes the thing that prevents you from loading is that for some reason an assembly went into multiple places. And you didn't expect it, and the application chose one location to load it from, but this place didn't contain another dependency, okay? So a good way to find it is by looking at this HTML file that was generated and see exactly where is the searches and where the application found the file, so you can get a better understanding of why it failed on loading this assembly. So it's a good tool to have in your tool belt. Another thing that might happen, because not everything is a native, is a managed assembly, is a .NET assembly. Sometimes you fail because of a native assembly, and you don't really see all those logs that I just showed you. So proc monitor, yes, process monitor by sysinternals, procmon as a short, is another tool that you can use. It's really, really helpful, and it logs all the events happening in the operating system for different areas, like networking, files, registry, and so on. So usually what you want to do is just open this application and choose to see only the file system, and then filter to the name of your application. So this will filter and show you all the events that are relevant to your application. And then you can see the operation that failed. Specifically, you're funded by the status of this operation. You can filter to only show things that failed, and then see exactly why. Okay. Okay, so I talked about the breakpoint. I don't have much time, so I'll try to rush it a bit. So another useful thing that might help you is the conditional breakpoint. Okay. Do you know about conditional breakpoints? Okay, so it's a really, really powerful tool. What I want to show you is that one of the things that is missing from .NET, from Visual Studio, is what we call the data breakpoint. Okay, so this is actually kind of frustrating, because if you look into Visual Studio breakpoint window over here, you will see that there is something called data breakpoint, but it's grayed out. Okay, data breakpoint is a way to create a breakpoint that will stop whenever a field is being modified, okay? Because sometimes you have an application, at some point you see the value which is a correct value, and in another location you have the value with an incorrect value, and you want to know who changed it, where in the code it was changed. And this feature is only available for C++, okay? Okay, so this is a problem. But one of the things that, again, Oscode provide, and this is really, really useful tool, is the ability to stop at the point where a property has changed. So just as an example, let's see this little demo. So in this little demo, I have an application that is processing orders and sending those orders into the customers and sending invoices. Okay? And what we found out in the logs, let's say this is the log, we saw that for some customers, you see, we are sending orders for customer 14, but for some reason, some of the invoices are sent to other customers. and this is not okay. And customers are complaining that they are receiving invoices for things that they haven't purchased. Okay? So clearly there's a problem here. At some point, the number of the customer, the ID of the customer was correct, and in another location it was changed. So let's see why. So if we go here and start this in debug mode, and specifically I'm going to stop at the location where I know is going to print this message. And we have here this order info class, okay? And this order info, what I know is that when I'm sending the invoice right over here, the sender itself is changing, okay? So let's move one way. So now I see the order info, okay? And this order info object contains a customer object, you see over here. So what I can do, I can create I can now go and create a conditional breakpoint on this field itself. I can specify, using this magic wand, that I want, when set, I want to break. Okay? And so this will create kind of a breakpoint on this field specifically. Now what I know is that I don't want to see this changing of the property when I'm setting the property for the first time, okay, when I'm creating my new instance. So this basically means that I want to see only when this customer is not null, meaning if there's already a value inside this customer field and it is changing, then I want the breakpoint to occur. Okay? So I'm just going to run it now and remove my old breakpoint. And here, you see, value of customer was being set. Okay? And I can go now into my call stack and see where exactly it happened. And what I can see is that the developer who did it is not okay. Okay? And instead of using the object of the receiver to specify who to send the product to, it set the customer into the receiver, and then it was being sent on, okay? So I found that because something was not okay in the code, someone has changed one of the properties to wrong values. And this is something that can be quite difficult to do, especially if you don't own the code for that specific property. Okay, so we saw this. Okay, so let me talk about a little thing before we stop, because we don't have much time, and this is production debugging, okay? You have an application running in the field and something is happening and you need to get insight into what happened. So here a simple story. I have a student was given an assignment to create a backgammon game. You know about what is backgammon? Okay, so it was a game, and he came to me and say, whenever I start my application, Visual Studio crashed, okay? And okay, I said, okay, bring me the code, let me see. And I'm starting to look inside, and I'm trying to debug it, okay? And I'm going inside and trying to debug, and all of a sudden, Visual Studio just refresh itself, and the application restarts, okay? So I'm doing it again, and I'm going, okay, let's go step in. I'm going to step in, and again, I'm F10, F10, and suddenly, after another F10, the application just restart itself. Here, it just stopped, okay? And this is a problem, and I couldn't understand why, and you can't really debug. So one of the things that people don't know is that Visual Studio allows you to debug an executable file. You can just open the exe in Visual Studio and click debug, okay? So after it was compiled, you don't need to the code itself. You can just run the executable under Visual Studio, just like you are doing attached to another process. And when I did that, because I had the sources in my system, I got this exception, okay? I got a Stack Overflow exception. And it took me to the sources itself. So basically, at that point of time, it doesn't happen anymore in Visual Studio, by the way, but in 2015, if you had this Stack Overflow and the locals window tried to show this property, it made Visual Studio collapse. Okay? But this way, it helps you to find the bug. So you can debug executable file under Visual Studio, and it's really, really helpful. And the last thing I'm going to show is what happened when Visual Studio itself crashed. Okay, crashed. So in this place, in this little demo, I had something I loaded from the database, a library, and I wanted to use it. And I added it into my project. And for some reason, whenever I started this application, Visual Studio just crashed. So what you do in these cases, and people don't think about it, is that you can use Visual Studio to debug Visual Studio. So basically, all you need to do is to attach Visual Studio to another instance of Visual Studio, perform the operation you want in the Visual Studio that is, let's call it, infected, and then you get specifically what was the problem that made Visual Studio crash. In this specific instance, because I loaded this library from the database, Windows decided that this is some library that is suspicious. So it locked the file, okay? And so I got an access violation. All I needed to do is then go into this file, right-click, go into property, and there was an unlock button. I don't know if any one of you have seen it, but you have an unlock button that you sometimes have on things that you load from, download from the internet. And it was really, really hard to find without having this little magic that showed me specific what is the access violation that I had. Okay, so the time is up, unfortunately. So we talked about how to debug a real-life application and how you can use several tools like .pick and the breakpoints that you can put anywhere in your code. I showed you a little bit about managing those exceptions and putting breakpoints. Talked about symbols that you can load with .pick. And a little bit about what we call production debugging or post-mortem debugging, when the application crashed and you want to go and investigate dumps and things like that. So, thank you very much. I'll be at the speaker zone that you can come later and ask me if you have any question. And feel free to contact me via Twitter. Thank you.